This lecture is covering Chapter 4 in Lewis Vaughn's Doing Ethics, and for this lecture we'll be looking at the power of moral theories. Now you're going to want to make sure that you read the chapter in its entirety because in this lecture I'm not going to be covering everything in the chapter, just some of the major highlights. And so to begin, we can ask the question, what is a moral theory? Well, one of the things I like to say whenever I'm teaching a course on ethics is that part of studying ethics is to discover what we already know. And what I mean by that is I don't think that as we're studying ethics this semester that we're going to necessarily obtain new knowledge about ethical principles. Maybe in some cases that will happen, but that's not necessarily the end goal. Some of the things that we're studying this semester will be things that you already know. But what we want to do further than that is to become aware of how we know what we know. And one of the ways that we discover how we know what we know is by contemplating particular moral dilemmas. So to begin, we'll look at a famous moral dilemma known as the trolley problem. Now, in this dilemma, you are this person standing at a switch that can divert a trolley that is heading down a track and it's about to hit 5 people, but you can flip the switch and it will make the trolley cart go on another track so that you avoid hitting these 5 people here on the track. Now, the simple moral question at this point is, if you are standing in this position, are you morally obligated to flip the switch? Now, most people who consider the trolley problem at this level will say, yes, the moral problem seems simple. If you have the opportunity to flip the switch, you are morally obligated to do it. But what makes this scenario a dilemma is that just as you're about ready to flip the switch, you realize there is actually one person tied to the other track. Now, before we consider this situation further, there's a few things I should let you know about the trolley problem. To make this really a moral dilemma, we have to assume that everybody that's on the track is innocent. Nobody deserves to be there. And so it's not like you're flipping the switch to, kill 5 Hitlers and save one Mother Teresa. It's nothing like that. Everyone has the same moral standing on the track. And so the first question in this trolley problem is, what is the morally right thing to do? Should you let the trolley go straight? And if you do that, you will take the lives of 5 people who are tied to the track. Or should you flip the switch and take out 1 life? What is the correct action to do? And an even deeper question is, what moral theory helps you make this decision? Well, if we brainstorm, one common theory that students will come up with in the class is that they'll say, well, if you consider the 5 who are on the track, you have 5 individuals, and you might say that each individual that's on the track has the same unit of value. So we have 5 units of moral value on the right side of the track, and if you look at the person who is on the other track, this person is equally as valuable as every person that's on the other side of the track, but there's only one person, so there's 1 unit of value. And so many times what students will say is that we are morally obligated to flip the switch, which will cost the life of 1 person, but will save 5 lives. And the reason why that is oftentimes considered a morally correct action is because it's better that 1 life would be lost than 5 lives. And when somebody argues that way, they're really arguing as a utilitarian. Utilitarian says that the right action is that which brings about the most happiness for the most amount of people, or if you're to put it in the negative, it's whatever reduces suffering for the most amount of people is the morally right action. And so in this case, saving 5 lives is better than saving 1 life because you are promoting 5 units of value over 1 unit of value. And that is the utilitarian principle. And so that is one way to argue this dilemma. Flip the switch, because saving 5 lives is better than letting 1 life die, even though in both situations it would be a tragedy. Well, now you can consider whether or not this utilitarian principle is viable by considering another scenario. In this scenario, you are a guy standing on a bridge, and you still have 5 individuals who are tied to the track. The trolley is about to hit the people on the track, but now you have a decision to make, and that is you can push this large man off a bridge, and by doing so, the large man will stop the trolley cart and thus saving 5 individuals. Now, when we think about this scenario, sometimes people will ask, well, couldn't you just jump off yourself? Well, the problem with you jumping off yourself is that you are not large enough to stop the trolley, but the guy who's standing on the bridge is. In this scenario, would it be appropriate to apply the utilitarian principle to pushing the large man off the bridge? If you thought in the first scenario it's better to flip the switch, take the life of 1 person and save the life of 5 people, what makes this scenario different in principle? Well, many people, when they think about this second situation, many people intuitively say that it is not all right to push the man off the bridge, even if they think that it's okay for them to flip the switch in the first scenario. Well, what makes these situations different? Whenever you think through a dilemma like this, you are engaging in moral reasoning, and you are thinking deeply about moral theories. And so a moral theory is really just an explanation of what makes an action right, or what makes a person good, or what makes a thing good. And so a moral theory is what helps us understand our moral reasoning. And so there are many different types of moral theories that have been developed. So I briefly just introduced you to the utilitarian theory. Next week we will spend some more time looking at utilitarianism. This is a form of what's called consequentialist reasoning. So when we're thinking about consequentialism, what we're saying is an action is morally right or wrong based upon the consequences that result from that action. And so utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. And the types of consequences that you're concerned about in utilitarianism is that which brings about happiness for the most amount of people, or if you put it in the negative, that which reduces suffering for the most amount of people. Whenever you think that way, you are thinking like a utilitarian. There's other moral theories as well, such as libertarianism. The libertarian principle says we ought to protect individual rights, so long as people don't use those individual rights to infringe upon the free rights of someone else. So if you are concerned about individual rights and freedom, you might be living according to a libertarian principle. There's also egalitarianism, which says that the right thing to do is that which promotes fairness. So the equality principle is really what the egalitarian principle is, fairness for the most amount of people. And we'll look at that principle later this semester. There's also Aristotle's virtue theory, which we'll have to talk about later. And then there's deontology, which is promoted by the philosopher Immanuel Kant, as well as various religious traditions and natural law theory. And so we'll look at deontology here in a couple weeks. And so these are just a few examples of different moral theories. Whenever we're thinking about moral theories, the focus is not really on the rightness or goodness of an individual or specific action or persons. Instead, we're trying to get at the very nature of rightness or goodness itself. That's why we study moral theories. That's why we study these various moral principles. Now, if you think, well, why would somebody spend so much time diving into these various moral theories? Well, one answer to that is that diving into moral theories is actually unavoidable. So if you've ever wondered about what makes an action right, well, whenever you do that, you are engaging in moral theorizing. Even if you try not to think much about morality, but instead you just rely on your default moral theory or your gut instincts, even if you do that, you're still living by the light of some moral theory. Or even if you reject all moral theories and deny the possibility of any objective standard for morality, or say you embrace the subjectivist view of right and wrong, you're still using some form of moral theory. So whether you're trusting in the utilitarian principle, whether you're trusting in your gut feelings, whether you think that morality is just completely subjective, different people have different moral values and they can do whatever is right for them, or whether you're even just completely apathetic and you don't think it's worth your time to study moral theories. No matter what you do, you are engaging in some sort of moral theory. So whether you're aware of it or not, you will live according to some moral standard. And that's one of the reasons why it's at least worth our time to think through what moral theories should we promote, if any. So if you ask, well, what do moral theories do? Well, moral theories, as you develop them, they help us assess our principles for various different kinds of cases, and then they help us generate new principles to live by if we need to. They also shed light on our various moral judgments and helps us realize whether or not those moral judgments are sound. And then they corroborate or challenge various aspects of our moral experience. Now, we should also think about what moral theories do not do. So a moral theory does not, by itself, give us precisely tailored answers to questions about the rightness or wrongness of specific actions, or the goodness or badness of a specific person or thing. So let's think again about the trolley problem. Let's say Bill and Ted are disagreeing about whether we should save 5 lives in this scenario or whether we should save 1 life. Well, Ted says we should save 5 lives. And so if we ask Ted to give us a reason, so Ted says, yes, we should save 5 lives. Well, what's your reason, Ted? Well, Ted wants to ground his belief in the utilitarian principle. And he says the reason why we should save 5 lives is because that will promote happiness for the most amount of people, or it's going to reduce suffering for the most amount of people. So yes, if you save 1 life, you'll save that life, but 5 will die, and so that will contribute to more suffering for their family or whoever else it might be. And so Ted is arguing using the utilitarian principle. Well, Bill disagrees with Ted and says, no, we should save 1 life. Now, if you ask Bill, why should you save 1 life? Bill still wants to argue like a utilitarian, but he reasons in a different way. Bill says, maybe in this scenario, it looks like we should flip the switch and let 5 lives live over 1. But think about the precedent that we're setting when we do such a thing. If we change the scenario, as we did just earlier, to somebody who is on the bridge, the large man who's on the bridge, does that mean that we should push that man off the bridge? No, that type of society is not the type of society that anyone wants to live in, and so that actually isn't the type of society that promotes happiness for the most amount of people. Or let's suppose we switch the scenario again. Suppose we're not even talking about the trolley problem anymore. Suppose we're talking about an emergency room. And in an emergency room, let's suppose that we have 5 sick patients who are about to die, unless if they get the relevant transplants of various different organs. And then all of a sudden, 1 completely healthy person walks into the emergency room who has all the organs that are needed to save 5 lives. In this scenario, would it be morally correct to harvest the organs from the 1 healthy patient in order to save 5 lives? Well, in this scenario, most people would say no. Well, how can you argue that way as a utilitarian? Bill says the reason why we would argue that way as a utilitarian is because if we think about society as a whole, we don't want to live in a society where anytime you walk into the emergency room, you don't know whether or not you're going to be getting treated for your sickness or whether or not you're going to have your organs harvested. And so it's actually not a situation that promotes happiness for the most amount of people. And so Bill argues this way to say, this is why it is not appropriate to flip the switch, because we don't want to create situations where you never know whether or not you're going to be one of the unlucky 5 or one of the unlucky 1s. That is not, from a broad scale perspective, a situation that creates a happy society. Well, whichever argument that you find more persuasive, here's the important point to note. Bill and Ted both agree on the utilitarian principle, but they disagree on how to apply the principle. And so the important point to recognize here is even if you come up with a principle that you think is the right moral principle, that doesn't mean that there's going to be an automatic answer for every moral question or moral dilemma that you have. It's maybe the start of arriving at a way to reason through moral principles, but it doesn't just give you the right moral answer to every question that you have. And so a moral theory does not by itself give us answers to every question about the rightness or wrongness of specific actions. Now, when we think of different types of moral theories, there are two main types that your textbook talks about. And I've already mentioned these, but there's consequentialism, which is we can determine the rightness or wrongness of an action based upon the consequences of that action. And so we'll look at that more in the next chapter. But there's also what are called non-consequentialist moral theories. And in these theories, what makes an action right is the nature or the form of the action itself. So we will consider non-consequentialist moral theories in a couple chapters. Now, when it comes to evaluating theories, there's just 3 points that I think are important to bring out from your reading. One, I think it is important to acknowledge that some theories are better than others. If we don't have that as just a starting principle, then there's really no way to evaluate theories at all. So if we're going to evaluate theories and try to figure out what are the most appropriate moral principles, then we have to at least assume that some theories are better than others. And what that means is that it's possible to assess the worth of different moral theories. And this is true even if we accept the fact that no moral theory is perfect. And in fact, that's probably the case. But just because no moral theory is perfect, that doesn't mean that we can't find some moral theories that are better than others. And then the last thing to say about this chapter, if we're trying to figure out what criteria do we use to judge the adequacy of a moral theory, well, here are 3 criteria that I think are helpful. The first is consider the consistency that it has with considered moral judgments. So let's think back to the trolley problem again. When it came to thinking about pushing the large man off the bridge, right away that seemed to go against what are maybe normal moral judgments that we would make. And so if those go against what normally would be considered right, that calls into question at least whether or not we should use the utilitarian principle to justify that action. And it might be a moral judgment that causes us to reevaluate whether or not the utilitarian principle is a good moral principle to begin with. But we want to see whether or not a moral theory is consistent with considered moral judgments. The second criteria is whether or not it's consistent with our moral experiences. And here I'm just talking about, and your text is just talking about the moral feelings that you have. If you have a moral theory that leads you to moral conclusion X, but when you consider moral conclusion X, if it makes you feel like this can't be right, and it just goes against your moral experience, then that's at least some reason to say, let's reevaluate whether or not the moral theory is correct. Of course, this doesn't mean that our moral feelings are infallible. It's just saying that it should at least be part of the consideration when evaluating a moral theory. And then the third criteria is the usefulness of the theory in solving moral problems. So if you develop a moral theory that works great in theory but has no practical value, then it's probably a moral theory that's not actually worth further consideration. So we want to develop moral theories that are useful in the real world and not things that just sound good on paper. So that's all I have for this chapter. Again, make sure that you read thoroughly through the chapter and then take the quiz before the end of the week.